I think a lot of the legal AI companies are selling fear.
There's Resonated, and then there's 7.6 million views on X.
But all of a sudden, it's like a slot machine going off and hitting the jackpot. I will say my work is just so much more like joyful since I figured this out.
I've got to ask Zack, obviously, about the InfoSec, the info security side of things.
Of course, this is something I've thought a lot about. The relevant skill here for humans is to get good at.
Welcome to Without Limitation. This is the podcast where we meet the people who are reshaping the legal industry. Now, my guest today is Zack Shapiro. Zack is the founder and managing partner of Reins. It's a law firm specializing in startups and scale-ups. And many of you will know Zack as the author of the Claude-Native law firm. It's a blog post that Zack wrote, and it went viral. It's had, as at the time of publishing this podcast, 7.7 million views on X. And that's totally unheard of, let's be honest, for a post about legal technology. It's also generated a huge amount of discussion and debate about the use of agentic tools like Claude for legal work. In the post, Zack lays out how he uses Claude day to day in his practice. And in our podcast discussion, we went a level deeper. We got into some of the specifics about how he uses technologies like skills and what a day in the life looks like in a Claude-Native law firm. We also got into some of the important topics around security and compliance and whether these tools are appropriate for law firms to be using with their clients. I enjoyed this discussion. If you are a law firm thinking about whether and how to use Claude for legal work, if you're a legal tech vendor thinking about integration opportunities, or you're just curious about where this is all going, I think Zack is a great person to hear from. So without further ado, let's get into it. Here's my discussion with Zack Shapiro, the founder of Reins and the author of the Claude-Native law firm.
Zack, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, what a couple of weeks you have had. I really appreciate you making the time to come on to the podcast. How's it been these last couple of weeks?
Thanks. It's been totally overwhelming, but also fun and exciting. I've had literally thousands of people reach out. I've gotten to have some really interesting conversations, working with some great new clients, and sort of really thinking about what opportunities there are for a next move. But it seems like the piece definitely sufficiently resonated with people that there's real interest out there in how to use AI in law.
Well, I mean, there's Resonated, and then there's 7.6 million views on X. So I'm not sure that a legal technology post has ever reached that level of virality. So big congratulations. And as we were just saying before we came on, in the list of problems to have when you're running a law firm, too many inbounds is probably a champagne problem to have.
Indeed.
Before we get into the post and everything that's been going on these last couple of weeks, I wanted to start a bit with your story, Zack, if that's okay. So you started off in big law, right? So you trained in big law with Davis Polk. Can you share a little bit more about your journey from there to, I think you founded a startup at one point, and then Reins?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was only in big law for about a year. I graduated from Yale Law School in 2016. I'd originally gone to law school thinking I wanted to be an academic. If I wasn't going to go to law school, I would have gotten a philosophy PhD and happily taught philosophy of mind and metaphysics. I was sort of persuaded by my philosophy professors in undergrad that you can do the same thing going to Yale Law School and just have better job security and spend less time sort of in training than you would with a PhD. But by the time I left law school, I was not totally sure I wanted to be a practicing lawyer. It's very common among ILS grads to clerk. You get clerkships very early on in your law school career. So I had clerkships lined up my first and third years out of law school with terrific judges here in New York City, Judge Engelmeyer on the Southern District of New York, and then Judge Lynch on the Second Circuit. And I had this year in between, and I was sort of committed to doing the clerkships. I knew that would be a cool experience, but I wasn't necessarily planning to do big law. I'd been a summer associate at Davis Polk, but to be honest, I was looking for something sort of more interesting and entrepreneurial in like the tech or business sector to do in that year in between, and then discovered that no one would hire me for 1 year, knowing I was going to leave and go back to the government, and I had no relevant business experience. And so one of the cool things about the year I spent at Davis Polk, I had a friend of mine who had just started a small crypto hedge fund, which was a pretty novel concept at the time, and asked me all these like really, at the time, really novel and interesting legal questions. And so at Davis Polk, I sort of raised my hand and said, if you get any crypto cases, I know there's not a lot of it right now, but like I would love to be involved. And then I got really lucky with the timing there. The year I was at Davis Polk was known in the crypto world as the ICO boom. It's where a lot of the cryptocurrencies were born. And so I got to do some pretty interesting crypto related regulatory and tech related work. That being said, when I got out of my second clerkship, I still wasn't convinced that I wanted to be a practicing lawyer. After spending 1 year in big law and 2 years clerking, I had a friend who was doing a e-commerce startup. This was a time where sort of direct to consumer companies were using Instagram and Facebook and Google to sort of scale nationally and doing incredibly well. And so the idea behind that startup was basically a digital department store where you share traffic and data between different e-commerce brands. All of my sort of co-founders there were e-commerce CEOs, but it was a pretty legally heavy startup, right? To negotiate all those agreements and deal with the data privacy issues. And so the sort of deal was I could come on as an operational co-founder and I would earn my keep by doing legal work, despite the fact I didn't have a ton of transactional experience. And then I would transition over to being a startup founder more than a lawyer. That was an awesome experience. It was like a mini MBA for me. We raised money from great VCs like Founders Fund and Abstract and Greycroft. And then sort of the business got acqui-hired in 2020. But I learned the exact opposite lesson I thought I would from that experience, which is I never want to be a startup founder again. That's just really hard. I have tremendous respect for the people who do that, but it's not me. But I loved being a startup lawyer. And so in 2020, I started a solo practice that was initially representing some of the e-commerce startups I'd worked with. And then, I sort of went back and started talking to crypto startups. I'd remembered that was like interesting when I did that at Davis Polk. And that snowballed into the current practice I have now at Rains. And so we've now worked with over 200 different clients, lots of interesting matters, corporate law, venture financings, regulatory. And that's sort of where I came into the AI world from.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, I spend a little bit of time in-house. And I always recommend it to junior lawyers because I think it just gives you such an edge when you're advising clients, when you've actually lived inside a business like theirs. The way of delivering legal advice when you're in a large law firm versus when you're there in real time on a sales call is totally different. And it makes all the sense in the world then that you continue from there into advising startups and founding Rains. So I guess let's talk a little bit more about the practice, if you would, Zack. So you said it's kind of mostly advising startups. Is there like a particular focus for the business? Are you focused on financings or disputes, or is it kind of full service within that sector?
It's really full service and generalist. My edge, especially having come out of a startup right before that, I actually think what you just said about in-house, I think is true. And I would say even bonus points for lawyers that have worked in non-legal roles inside a business. I think it's a little bit different, even being in-house as a lawyer versus having like a direct operational role. Rains is currently a 2-person firm. Each of us have had non-lawyer roles inside startups. I think that's really important to why I'm good at giving advice to clients is that I am thinking more like a startup founder than I am a lawyer. And I think that legal advice, at least in the corporate and transactional side, is absolutely an input into business decision making. And it's very important that the tail not wag the dog. So having been on the business side, having had sort of outside counsel myself, I think that really is important in terms of my ability to deliver good and actionable legal advice. I did see a little bit of the writing on the wall about how technology and eventually AI was going to, I thought, transform the practice of law. And so I made a really deliberate decision to be a generalist, to be the first point of contact for startups, really sort of at the intersection of business and law. And, we've been able to cover like a lot of the most important needs, right? So on the fractional GC side, we do everything from entity incorporation to, basic employment law to commercial contracts, corporate governance, really just all of the nuts and bolts of running a business. We also do venture financings. I personally sort of specialize in that. We also do some M&A, but we really do more on the venture financing side. And then, working with crypto clients is a really interesting special case of venture financings because there's all sorts of tricky, like the Y Combinator safe is the Y Combinator safe, the NVCA docs are the NVCA docs. But once you get, offshore foundations and token warrants and crazy stuff involved, you really work that financing muscle in an interesting way. And then the third is ad hoc regulatory advice. So I, aside from my legal practice, I'm the head of policy at a digital asset think tank in DC. So I really do specialize in digital asset regulatory. We have a pretty decent deep bench of like telehealth clients. And so we've become increasingly expert on that. And then recently, we've been pretty focused in AI. And so, insofar as there is such thing as expertise on the sort of AI regulatory questions, we're building that also. And I think especially with AI tools, like the market is just going to reward people who are thoughtful generalists who have sort of commercial sense and are just easy to work with over like your moat as a lawyer is like you have internalized decades of case law on this incredibly narrow question that like increasingly, knowledge is going to be commoditized.
Yeah, I think we're entering the age of the generalist or the age of the full stack, actually, and not just in law, but across industries. This idea that you only do one thing. I'm a product manager, so I can't generate UX. Or I'm as you say, a lawyer who only does hotels and leisure. Ask me a question about employment, and you may as well speak to me in a foreign language. I think, yes, there will be a need for depth of expertise in certain areas, like you with blockchain and digital assets, for example. But you've also got to be able to go answer a question about employment law and real estate potentially and all the rest of it. So it's kind of that idea of the T-shaped lawyer, which you hear sometimes. Let's turn our attention to this post, which probably 2 weeks on, Zach, you're fed up of talking about. And so I appreciate you spending time with me here talking about it. But obviously this was on X. So you posted it on X. Out of interest, presumably this wasn't your first post on X. So has that been a tool that you've used for business development up to this point, for getting content out there? And where did it really come from? How did this go from, let's be honest, most lawyers' content, if it gets, 100 likes, 200 likes, the lawyer's pretty happy. Getting to 7.6 million views, how did that happen?
Yeah, so I have been on X. The crypto world is pretty X oriented, and so I'd used it really more in my policy work. I'd occasionally tried to use it for business development for Reigns, had not been particularly successful at that. But where this came from is the new sort of X articles feature. X is trying to compete with Substack. It's allowing this sort of long form writing. And I had watched 2 AI related pieces go incredibly viral before I started writing. One of them is Matt Schumer's Something Big is Happening piece. And then the other is the Citrini Research article about how AI is going to wreck the economy. And I thought those are both really interesting. I thought it was really interesting how they resonated. And I had gone fully native with AI in my firm. I was seeing incredible efficiency gains from it. And I was watching a fervor develop around this question of what impact is AI going to have on white collar America. And I felt like, it seemed like I was using AI in very different ways than certainly other lawyers, but probably most other professionals. And I wanted to give specifically like some optimistic takes about actually like, here's what's possible now. And for the people who put in the effort to learn how to get good with AI, I think there are incredible dividends there. And look, and the flip side of the coin is for the people who don't, like it's going to be a pretty bad next 5 or 10 years. And so, I started writing articles. The one that went viral was my third. The first was, this concept of being an AI centaur that sort of came from the chess world right after the famous chess match where Deep Blue beats Garry Kasparov. There was about a decade where the best quote unquote chess player in the world was a combination of a human and AI, beat the best human or the best AI. And then eventually AI took over. And so what does it mean to be a human AI centaur? The next piece was the age of the entrepreneur. So like, what does this mean inside a larger organization? I had started to build pretty useful legal skills in Claude. And I realized, oh my God, this is a zip file I can send to my associate. I could send to 500 associates. And like my judgment encoded as a skill file, like can scale like software, which is weird. And, I was trying to think through the implications of that. And then the third piece was like really more laying out in the most detail I've done so far. All right, like how do I as a lawyer actually use this stuff? And that was the one that, really took off and struck a nerve. And I think like what was unique about that, and I've learned that lesson and I will have future articles that are more like this. People need this granular examples of like, what does this look like in practice? And once they see that, the wheels start turning and it becomes easy to see like AI in 2026 isn't the ChatGPT chatbot that like you use as an augmented version of Google, right? It is something else entirely now. And B, like this is a mindset thing more than it's a skill thing, right? Like I'm not describing, when I say I built skills, that sounds really fancy. Like the way I describe it in the article is like the first time I built skills, I saw that Anthropic put out a 33-page PDF on how to build skills. I was like, that's way too long and I'm not going to read that. And so I put it in Claude and I said, look at all our chats and tell me what the best skills you can build for me are, and then told it to go build them. That's really all there was to it in the first generation. So like there is really good news out here for people. I'm someone who's terrible at learning how to use new platforms and technology. Like I have clients who've tried to get me to use Carta and
Yeah.
Carta and Asana and Jira and all these things. And I'm terrible at it. I can't even figure out Notion well. And the way AI works is just different. It's just about learning how to talk to the thing.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree with that. And there are folks who are scared to get started or feel like it's a massive learning curve. And it's almost like if you can read, you can cook. And these days, it's, if you can just ask AI, I have literally no idea what these skills are. How do I get started with them? Or to your point, Anthropic just published a guide on how to produce skills. And can you please create for me a skill? I think since then, they've more recently published a skill for creating skills. So it's even easier. Like you just literally tell Claude and it follows a structured process for creating skills, which is mind boggling.
And
Last
specifically,
question.
right? Like
Yeah.
you don't need to worry when you say stuff like that it sounds complicated or a lot to keep up with. And like, I want people to say, like, you don't actually need to keep up with it. You just need to let the AI do that. Just describe your intent and you can get it. And like the relevant like skill here for humans is to get good at describing your intent. That's the only thing that matters.
Yeah, 100%. Last question for now, Zach, on the article. Was there like a moment when you were like, "Holy shit, this thing has gone viral"? You're there with your phone, and you're like, you've had 5 views, 10 views, 100 views. Is there a moment when you're getting like just constant notification pings, or how did that
Yeah,
play out?
it was at around 10,000 views where it like my previous pieces had done pretty well. I think one of them went to near 100,000 views before the one that went viral. And this piece was underperforming in the beginning. And then there was an inflection point at around 10,000 views where it's like, and I made the mistake of leaving my notifications on. And boy, does that experience like hijack your dopamine system. But all of a sudden it's like a slot machine going off and hitting the jackpot. And it's just like, I like didn't do anything for the next 2 hours. I sat there. I was just like, it's impossible to look away from what's happening on the screen. And luckily, this was a Friday afternoon, and so I had some time to relax and recover after that. But it is a very bizarre experience to have that happen.
Yeah, it's hard to stand out in this era of content and everyone can produce content, and how do you actually produce something that resonates with people? So congratulations on doing that and continuing to do that. So I wanted to talk a bit more about Claude. As you know, I'm a fan of Claude. You're a fan of Claude, and the piece was very much Claude-Native law firm. If you would, Zach, at a high level, and I know you don't want to give away too much of the secret sauce of the firm, can you talk through a matter, so not a real matter, but like just in general terms, piece of work comes into the firm, and are you, using Claude to draft the engagement letter? Are you using Claude to kind of like set up the matter in the system? Can you just share at a high level,
Yeah, I mean,
how you use
everything,
the tool?
right? Like everything I can reasonably use AI for, I do because it makes my work better and more efficient. I have I have a engagement letter skill that like it used to be sort of an annoying thing that I would go into Microsoft Word and I would edit the scope of the matter and I would, the name of the company and what's the size of the retainer. And now it's like a one sentence like line to Claude about, hey, engagement letter for this company addressed to this guy. Here's the size of the retainer, either standard scope that we do or like this is what the matter is about in one sentence, and then poof, I have a perfectly professional engagement letter pop out the back end, right? It's really about automating what can be automated. I think at a general level, maybe the most helpful thing is like first describing like why Claude, and then sort of what I think, at least the version of the secret sauce that like I would say in public. Why Claude? There are two things there for people who are still thinking about AI as ChatGPT in 2023, which is just like a really smart version of Google. It's a chatbot. And like, what is different now? Modern version of Claude has two features that are like, I think almost probably accidentally very powerful. The first is that Anthropic, the company that created Claude, is focused very heavily on making sure their AI is good at writing software. And so like when I first started using Claude, it was like my friends telling me that Claude Code, the sort of version of Claude for software engineers, is so incredibly powerful that you can just speak a website or app into existence. And that's cool. And so I did that and then realized that actually, and this was before Claude Cowork existed, writing code is an incredible superpower for lawyers who have to deal with apps on a computer, which are code. previously, like I'd used things like ChatGPT to help me think about what edits I would want to make to a contract. But the best it could do is like ChatGPT would spit out after our discussion, like a list of red lines, and then I would manually put them into Microsoft Word. And sometimes the formatting would break. And if I ever tried to like give ChatGPT a Word doc and say, like, can you edit this? It would just be a nightmare. It would be disaster. It's really bad at that. Post sort of Opus 4.5, I think at the time, and Claude Code, like the combination of those two things allows Claude to write code on the fly that can manipulate documents and Word. It will write in XML and then publish as a Word doc. And so it's a perfectly done red line attributed to me with all of the formatting working correct. Now, I'm part of this, like, I don't remember what it was like in the very earliest versions of my doing this. You might have to wrestle with it a little bit. And now I just have a skill that does it perfectly. But that was an incredible unlock. So the writing code is useful not just for software engineers. And then part two is Claude can, and especially through Cowork, can create and manipulate local files, usually markdown files, in folders on your computer, which is useful for ingesting information, right? If you want to give it a lot of context, if you're like a litigator and you want to use it for doc review, obviously it's very useful to be able to point it at a folder of discovery material and have it surface insights. Also, LLMs are limited by what's called their context window, which is essentially their memory. And it's limited to 1 million tokens, which for most conversations is more or less fine. But if you keep working with a LLM specific chat and you're using it because it knows about what you're talking about, eventually it will degrade in usefulness over time. Not so if you have the context for it in a markdown file. And you can use local files on your computer to be external memory for the LM that's different than its context window, that makes it functionally like perfect unlimited memory, right? Like Claude or ChatGPT can ingest a whole book now. It's not a length of text, and it can use that as context. You just need to have that live outside the LM. So that's really powerful. And then when you put those two things together, now you get like Anthropic's skills and plugins where you can take the sort of prompts you do, and the code can turn that into repeatable standard operating procedures that live in these local markdown files that really truly automate what you do. So that's like why Claude. And then in terms of like, there's this weird split online right now of people who are evangelizing the way I do about, oh my God, this has changed my life so much. I have superpowers. And then there's a bunch of people like, you guys must be high. I have no idea what you're talking about. This seems like smoke and mirrors and people doing productivity theater. And I think the difference, at the risk of like being obnoxious, like I think it is a skill difference, right? I think they're like, some people have figured out how to use this technology and other people haven't. And the best I can tell, and this is sort of the public facing version. I don't want to get into the very granular details of how I do this, but the two things that I really think would be sufficient for lawyers to figure out how to use AI the way I have. Number one is to realize that the LLM is like a fuzzy tool, right? If you put fuzzy input, you get fuzzy, sloppy output, and it's not going to be useful. On the other hand, if you are very disciplined about both the detail and specificity of the instructions you give it, what comes out the other end is magic. And a lot of sort of legal tech and legal AI, I think, is focused on exactly the wrong problem. It's going down the wrong path and focusing on the output, right? Like what contract templates, what brief templates can we train the AI on? The LM has been trained on just way more contract templates and brief templates than you could ever imagine. It's all in the training set. That's not the problem. The problem is the prompting. The problem is the instructions that go in, and that's where the secret sauce is. And the good news for lawyers is this is a skill that most of us already have. We're very good at being precise and detailed and specific about what we want because you have to be when you're making a legal argument. And if you're a senior lawyer and you're used to delegating work to associates, you know how to delegate work to associates. It's more or less the same thing. It's being really specific and detailed about your instructions. So that's sort of secret number one. And then secret number two is once you've done that for a while, you can use your own workspace as a reinforcement learning environment to build skills and automated workflows. So the story I told of creating my first skills, it's after I had enough sort of back and forth prompt chats. I said, all right, read this Anthropic guide and pull out of that what you think the most useful skills are. And then I refined those skills. And then once I built the skill, I continually update it. When it does something well, I reinforce that. I say, great, this went well. Please update the skill to make sure you do more of this in the future. When it does something poorly, I say, this didn't go so well. Why don't we update the skill to make sure this happens less in the future? And then the usefulness of your skills compound over time because they're software. And then you get to the point where like, okay, if you've built general purpose useful skills, you can proliferate them across your organization and like you can scale your skills to everyone who works with you. So
Yeah. I
like
mean, that
that's the roadmap.
retrospective skill where you're kind of saying, okay, thanks for doing that thing. Here's what you need to do better next time. Obviously, there's such parallels with working with human colleagues, but it resonates with me. I mean, we as a company, we use Claude Code in our engineering team, end to end. And with each feature, each pull request, we have a retro skill where we effectively have it look at what it did right, what it didn't do so well. It'll ask us questions, and then it will update the skill. And we definitely get benefits from doing that. The output is better each time. And I can totally see how you would use it that way in your practice. The stuff you said about engagement letters as well, Zach, I think is a great example. I mean, here we are in 2026. Engagement letters, we've been talking for like 25 years about the need to automate those. They're standard documents that law firms have, and yet most of the time they live in a partner's iManage or NetDocs. And for each case, she's digging out the engagement letter, or her secretary is, and populating it. And it's like, that should just be automated. And some firms have, but the use case makes perfect sense. I wanted to ask quickly about vibe coding, because you touched on something there. One differentiator between Claude generally, not just Claude Code, but even, the AI, Claude AI, is it can write code. And you talked about manipulating docx files, which is one good example. One thing I've seen people use it for, and some of our customers use it for, is like building dashboards and things like that. And I was just curious as to whether you're starting to vibe code stuff as part of the delivery of legal work, whether that's internal facing stuff for you and your associate, or whether you're building things as a way of delivering advice to your clients.
Yeah. I think the answer to that is no. There's not necessarily anything wrong with that. It's just not my philosophy of how I think this technology is most powerful. I put this on Twitter. I really think like, what is the best UI for how AI works, 5 years from now? I think it's like the scene from the movie Her, where Joaquin Phoenix boots up the OS and it sort of reads everything on his computer for context. It starts to interview him for a little bit. And it's like, okay, I got it. Here are the ways I can be helpful. And I am really skeptical of any kind of UI harness or dashboard or anything that can sort of intermediate that. My clients have legal needs, right? They're trying to figure out how to do something. They want to understand how legal questions, interact with that. If they're asking for advice, they need a contract to codify what they're doing, right? I want to deliver that, and anything that's sort of in between sort of their intent and my delivery, I think kind of gets in the way more than it helps.
Yeah, no, it's fair. I mean, I think one thing I anticipate may start to happen in the coming months is we might start to see people move away from the memo as the primary way of delivering legal advice. So if you take the scenario, Zach, of, I don't know, you're advising a client on crypto regulations across states or jurisdictions, countries even maybe. There was a time when we all would have just submitted hey, here's your memo, it's a document. And I wonder if Claude's great, to your point about manipulating documents. It can probably build world maps with red, amber, green by jurisdiction. And I just think we'll start to see, maybe to your point, not yet us delivering vibe coded apps as a way of delivering advice, but maybe just documents that convey information better than, hey, here's a docx file and you'll figure out the answer on page 57. It's in there somewhere. I've just noticed it's very good at that.
Yeah. So maybe, but I'd push you on that. In a really mature version of this technology, right? Why would you want a map, right? So the type of project I'm imagining you would do this for is some sort of 50 state legal review, right? What's the different sales tax regime for this particular e-commerce thing, right? And the V1 would be, here is a memo we spent a whole bunch of time on, and it's formatted nicely, and it goes by state law, state by state. What you're envisioning is step 2, which might be, here's an interactive thing, which might be easier for the client to ingest. Thinking is what is the client asking for when they're asking for a 50 state thing? What you might actually deliver them is okay, here is the answer encoded in the relevant format for whatever you're actually asking for, right? We figured it out, we're confident what the laws are, and here is the code to put into your sales engine or whatever that's going to be compliant state by state in all 50 states. And we don't need to have that intermediate conversation. And if the answer is clear, right? You really maybe don't need to have that intermediate conversation. And if there is a sort of judgment question in there, right? And I've written now a couple pieces about how I think that is sort of the kernel of what is going to persist for lawyers in terms of adding value. And there's a judgment question. Probably you want to just get right to that judgment question. And maybe a visual aid will be helpful, and maybe like vibe coding sort of visual aids on the fly will be useful. I'm just sort of reflexively skeptical that any sort of like intermediary work product is the best and highest use of the AI.
Yeah. So you almost think straight to output. Like, here is the script to embed in your
Yeah,
site,
maybe. Look,
or
I think
here
it
is
really
the
depends on the use case, but
yeah.
that's just an example of like, what really needs to shift here with this is like the mindset for what this technology envisions. And it's like, the car is not just like the horse and buggy, but better, right? It's a different thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the use of the Claude within the firm today. So, I mean, is it the first thing you're opening in the morning, or are you still opening your Outlook or your Gmail or whatever? Your
Gmail. I
emails
mean,
then?
Gmail's the first thing because
Yep.
that's sort of where the requests come from. But overwhelmingly, it's the thing I'm spending the most time in front of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. It's where I do my lawyering. Whereas I would have said before that, I did most of my lawyering in front of Microsoft Word files.
Yeah. Yeah. It was always the case that it was Outlook when you're in Big Law, because Big Law is always in Outlook. Outlook, you start your day, and that's kind of the ever present throughout the day. And lawyers are using that as more than just a communication tool. We're using it as a project management a system of record for the work. It's insane actually how we all use Outlook. I once met an in-house counsel who said to me, I've spent most of my adult life in Microsoft Outlook, which was like,
That's pretty depressing.
well, that was my take.
Better than government. When I was clerk in the Southern District, we used Lotus Notes. In
Yeah.
2017, we're using Lotus Notes, which is just amazing.
Yeah, that's even more depressing, I
perfect.
think. But we worked it out, and it wasn't far off true, actually, when we figured out how long he'd spent at work and how much of his time at work he had Outlook open. He'd spend a ton of time. But yeah, it was always start your day in Outlook, and then you do the substantive work in Word. Never touch Excel. Lawyers and Excel don't mix. It's like it's just impossible. But it's interesting how that's changed for you guys
It's
already.
changed, and it's changed in like some pretty profound ways, again, really recently with this agentic tool. So first of all, like I will say my work is just so much more like joyful since I figured this out. Like I get to wake up and the drudgery is basically gone, and I get to do the stuff that I went to law school for. Right. I mean, I guess I thought I wanted to be a professor, so not exactly, but I get to do the stuff that one goes to law school for. And like that feels awesome. And I feel like I, in many cases, have superpowers relative to like, counsel across the table that isn't doing this stuff. And it's just so much better than spending my time formatting Microsoft Word. Like, oh my God. And then the other is like, I totally hear you on Excel. I never, ever, ever learned how to use Excel. But for the first time, like, I'm not doing Excel, Claude is, but I can do it. Like, that's just not a barrier anymore in a way that it used to be.
Claude for Excel is excellent. It's great. I saw a poll on LinkedIn recently. Should lawyers learn Claude or should they learn Excel? And I was like, just learn Claude because it does both. I can't see a world in which lawyers are writing formulas in Excel. If they haven't for the last 40 years of Excel's existence, it's not going to change now.
Yeah. My wife works at a hedge fund and she is still like manually better with Excel, I think, than AI is, but I think that's only a matter of time as well.
It's a matter of time before Claude is entered into those. They have the annual Excel World Championships, don't they? And we'll see whether Claude is allowed to enter next year. Okay, so that's interesting. So email is still the hub for work. And do you see that changing anytime soon? And would you see a world in which you're, how are you going to get work out of email? Because right now it's manual, right? You have to drag an attachment from the email into Claude or copy and paste stuff over into Claude. That feels like the next thing that needs to be automated to me.
Yeah, we are working on that. Like I'm very lucky. I have a terrific associate who I work with who also is pretty proficient at vibe coding. And so we are like looking into solutions there. Email's a little sensitive, right? Just from like a data privacy perspective, I'm very wary of giving AI real access to email, both because of what's in there and not having control over like what a client says, and now AI can see it, and also just like the right functionality, right? Like, one technology I really haven't explored so much is the like fully agentic, like OpenClaw stuff, just because that's beyond my current sort of risk tolerance.
I wanted to ask about voice. So I think I saw in the article that you have developed a skill for it to kind of read stuff to you, or I can't remember if it was that, or you were using voice to interact with
No, the
Claude.
other way around.
Other way around, at a high level, what's the thinking there, and how does that benefit you with your work?
Yeah, I have bad eyesight, and so reading really long things takes me a while. For regular contract, it's not a problem. Microsoft Word, I can just zoom in. Or for certain things where, like, if I'm really thinking about a long document, it can be helpful for me to listen to it. And so, yeah, that's not particularly like that's Claude Code plus technology from 11 Labs created a sort of custom internal tool that does that in a really compelling way for me. I would have thought if you'd asked me, like, all right, you described this technology that existed, and you asked me like 6 months ago, do I think I would be typing into it or using my voice? I would have thought that voice was better. I will say though, like the freedom to be able to, I write really long prompts, right? My prompts are often 2,000 words long, right? I'm writing an essay into Claude, and the ability to just like mash my hands into the keyboard and not worry about grammar or spelling or like thought structure. And, it's a feature, not a bug, to be redundant about the things that matter. Like the speed I can get out of that actually is better than voice to text for me.
I'm with you on that. Like a lot of people aren't with us on that. And some people are saying, I much prefer voice. But for me, like typing is almost connected to my brain. I'm thinking as I'm typing, and then I'm sometimes restructuring things or deleting something. And it just works better for me. But I know there are people out there who disagree, and they much prefer voice. Last question on Claude. I've got to ask Zack, obviously, about the InfoSec, the info security side of things. Lots of chatter online about, is Claude suitable for legal work versus some of these enterprise AI tools? How do you think about that? Is that something that keeps you awake at night? Obviously, you've done an analysis of it and got comfortable, as have some others. But just share a little bit more about that.
Look, of course, this is something I've thought a lot about. And here I want to be careful not to be overly prescriptive, because what drives a lot of this is like attorney ethics and the duty to be responsible in your individual case. And I do think this is a question each attorney needs to answer for themselves. A couple of general things I would say though. Number one, I think that the confidentiality and privilege are separate questions. I tend to think that the privilege question is actually easier. A lot of the sort of the negative reactions to my article were people citing the Hepner case from Judge Rakoff to me. And that's just a misunderstanding of the Hepner case. The Hepner case was a client, not a lawyer, using a public version of an LM that was allowed to train with sort of terms of service that made it clear that there was no expectation of privacy. A law firm using AI to generate attorney work product for clients critically with the ability to train, turn off. I think that's table stakes. Everyone needs to do that. Hard for me to see how that's not privileged. So like, I just think that's a different posture. And it could be that there is case law that comes out that changes this. Just from first principles, think about it all, like I've looked at all the relevant bar opinions, and I don't think privilege is so much of the problem. Then there's the problem of data confidentiality. And I think that's just a more complicated one. And I think a lot of that comes down to how sensitive is the data. For transactional, and corporate lawyer like myself, most of the data, it's like confidential, but it's not that confidential, right? And so like the question is then from the suite of options from like, look, no one should be using a public version of the LMs where the frontier labs are allowed to train, right? That's just not responsible. And then from the like, okay, do we use like full data functionality in a cloud host environment? Do we need a custom DPA in a cloud environment? Do we have a 0-day retention agreement in a cloud environment? Do we use local inference? Do we use sort of the new generation of like encrypted AI? Do we use some sort of local model to redact client data before it goes in? Or, is there some data as opposed to others that like, we're just not going to put in AI because it's too sensitive? I think that really is, if you're going to sort of execute your sort of ethical responsibility as a lawyer, you actually have to look on a case-by-case basis and think holistically. What I would say, though, is two things. Number one is you do need to weigh some of these data privacy concerns against like the capabilities of these models. And your duty is to provide the best like legal service you can. And in most cases, I don't think that's completely shunning AI. I think you're getting the balance wrong if the answer is no AI. And second, to be totally transparent with you, and look, I've been, gotten in arguments with these folks online. I think a lot of the legal AI companies are selling fear, right? I think they are selling a fundamentally counterproductive product that is like, if I'm being totally honest, I think like if you use one of these platforms and you use it and it's highly opinionated and you are the checkbox guy, which is kind of how a lot of these are set up, you're setting yourself up to actually get automated away. It is the opposite of the empowerment I'm talking about of using AI. And they need to sell these expensive products to people that are eventually going to actually take their jobs. And how do you sell that? You sell fear that if you don't do this, you're going to get sued for malpractice. And so, like, I would take that with a grain of salt. Like, attorneys need to familiarize with themselves with the ethical rules. They need to familiarize with themselves with the technology they're using and like actually exercise that responsibility yourself rather than just picking up on whatever the sort of fear message du jour is.
How do you guys price for the work? I think I read that most of you are on like monthly retainers, but for you, has Claude kind of like torpedoed billable hours, or can you say a little bit more about the pricing? Because I suspect there's big law folks listening to this who are like, gosh, what Zack is doing now is probably what we're going to be doing in a year or two in one way or another. So how do we need to think about pricing?
Yeah, it hasn't torpedoed the billable hour yet. I'm hoping it will. The problem with getting rid of the billable hour is although the sort of work product we are creating is not really denominated in hours of work, right? That's becoming increasingly untethered. Like the value add and the work that went in, or that equation is breaking. My capacity to like exercise judgment and think and pay attention, and my associates' capacity is measured in human hours, right? And so in terms of like how many clients can we reasonably take on? Like, look, we can take on bigger, more complex clients who can pay us more for more complex projects, but like there needs to be a cap on how much time we can commit to spending so we don't overextend ourselves and fall into the temptation that I think a lot of people using AI have of like just not checking it, right? Just relying on the AI and passing on the work product as is. I don't want to do that, right? I do want to be actually a good lawyer who's practicing law. And so what it looks like now is we have sort of hourly rates, directionally, they're about half the cost of big law. Our services tend to cost more like a quarter. I think we get another 50% reduction in overall costs just because of efficiency. And so, unsurprisingly, we win a lot of clients from big law. And then we have a subscription that is, that's how I prefer to work with clients, between hourly and subscription. It is denominated in like a cap of human hours, but it's calculated to be for most of our clients functionally all you can eat. And it's sort of a break on the hourly rate. I do think probably at some point in the future when we are confident enough that we are not going to run into this requires a lot of human attention. I would love to move to entirely all you can eat subscriptions. I don't think the tech is quite there yet. And again, I think just like billable hours set a bad incentive, like flat all you can eat, if you're not confident you'll have the time to give the client service, I think provides another sort of bad temptation.
So two final questions for you, Zack. Not really directly about Claude. One is you're running a 2-person law firm. You've obviously scaled your capabilities beyond 2 people by outsourcing some of the work to an AI, agentic AI tool. One of the growing challenges that I'm hearing people talk about online is that the intensity of work is increasing because it's this idea that how many monitors do you have, Zack? Are you like a one monitor guy? You just got one.
Just a laptop. Okay. I don't even use an external monitor.
There's more chatter online about I've got 4 windows open now. I've got 4 Claudes running because is the vision for you guys to scale the firm through Claude, or can you see?
We already have, and we'll continue to scale the firm through Claude. And although I don't have multiple windows open, I have multiple Claude chat and cowork sessions going at any given time to do various tasks that I need, right? And so one of the nice things is the agents do work in parallel, and that's great. And there is some work that scales really well relative to others. So certain types of transactional work where there is a very limited amount of judgment, right? So what are the high level deal terms? And there's a huge amount of execution. That scales great, right? Because me plus Claude, right? I plus Claude am replacing a partner plus a team of associates. And so I can capture a lot of value there, right? Because it can be automated away. Taking on a increasingly large number of clients doesn't scale the same way because you need to exercise judgment for each client. And so in order to scale that way, I would have to hire more people and I would need people who know how to use AI in the way I do. And frankly, that's not a lot of attorneys. And so there are some types of scaling that are easier than others, but I'm sort of interested in all of that. And again, to be transparent, there is this weird moment now where a lot of people are sort of looking at the way, specifically I'm practicing law and I'm trying to think about, all right, are there ways to have an asymmetric impact? And so what I would say is if there are folks listening to this who are sort of managing partners at big law firms or in big tech companies, or, large in-house teams, I would love to play sort of a small role in what I think is sort of a optimistic version of the inevitable transformation of white collar legal work that AI is going to drive. And I think there is a version of this where everyone is inside, Harvey and Lagora and Spellbook, and like everything becomes a process. And I think that's honestly a pretty pessimistic way for this to go. And then I think there's a version of this where lawyers realize that like we actually have a lot of the innate traits that make you super powered at using AI. And, lawyers get used to using the bare metal here. And then the market for legal services, right? Like, I'm sure there will still be some job disruption, but like you can serve so many more clients. And so maybe legal services become more available. Lawyers get to spend more time doing the good stuff, exercising judgment. And it could really be an optimistic outcome for our profession. And so if there are angles here where I don't know if it's helping training or some sort of like forward deployment or whatever, like that is sort of what I'm pondering as another potential next step.
Interesting. Okay. How can folks reach you if they're interested to work with you on that?
For sure. You can send me a DM on Twitter. I'm at Zack B. Shapiro, ZackBShapiro, or shoot my firm an email, info@rains, RAINS.law. Probably two easiest ways.
Okay, great. Last one for you, Zack. What's next? So you've obviously talked about possibly some ideas or opportunities that were already coming to you. Obviously, Y Combinator this year backed, I think, 2 AI law firms and 1 semi-AI law firm in the latest batch. And there's talk of VC money flowing into the law firms. Is that something that you would entertain, are entertaining? Are you looking to scale the firm that way? Or, yeah, what's next for you and Rains?
Probably not. I mean, something I'd want to think about more. My concern about like the AI law firms that have raised venture money from the beginning is that the incentives are the opposite of the normally bad incentives of the billable hour, which are we're going to completely automate literally everything, including the judgment, and deliver slop. And look, some of these firms are better than others. I don't want to call out any in particular, but you need actual good lawyers doing the lawyering, and then you can automate around that. And so I don't really know what I'd necessarily do with VC money right now. Like the tools are here. Like one of my next steps is like, there is another generation of like skill I can create. And like one day might I sell my entire sort of agentic workflow to like a big tech company? I'd be super interested in that. Before I started Rains, what I'd looked at as some of the precedent is Atrium, which is sort of an early experiment in this, right? They had the same sort of subscription model that I use with a lot of my clients, plus a tech firm. And like, what was the tech firm really doing? They raised, $60 million of venture money. I don't need $60 million of venture money to keep building the skills I'm using. And so I don't imminently see wanting to raise venture money, but look, if you're a VC out there and you have an interesting idea, like I'm happy to have conversations.
Zack, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate you sharing everything that you've learned from using Claude. And I think there's some real practical tips here for everybody who's trying to wrap their head around this. It still amazes me that we're at this time where, you can have conversations with folks and they've not yet figured out what skills are, or they still think Claude is like a bad version of ChatGPT. And I think it's just great to have folks out there like you who are demonstrating how this can be used for legal work. So congrats again on the little post. I'm sure it won't be the last, and I'll let you get back to those inbound leads, which I know are piling up in your inbox. But thanks again.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.